This is going to be an audacious video. Here, I aim to do something that many philosophers since David Hume 300 years ago have argued cannot be done. I'm going to derive moral ought conclusions from purely descriptive premises. Actually, Hume never argued that this cannot be done. Hume said, quote, "For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it is necessary that it should be observed and explained, and at the same time that a reason should be given for what seems altogether inconceivable, how this new relation can be a deduction from others which are entirely different from it." End quote. I can accept that. I owe an explanation. That's what this video is all about. And when I get done, it's quite possible, maybe even likely, that my attempt will be just as flawed as the other attempts made in the past 300 years. Or perhaps it isn't. Let's find out. In deriving ought from is, I'm going to start with the pro tanto practical ought. This is the type of ought that I will equate with the phrase has a reason. A person ought to do something in this sense, in the same way that a person has a reason to do something. Think about a case in which somebody tells their roommate, "You ought to sign up for this class." The roommate asks, "Why?" Here, the person making the recommendation needs to answer by providing a reason for the roommate to take the class. In other words, in this context, the answer to the question, "Why ought I to do this?" is the answer to the question, "What reason is there for me to do this?" Now, by calling this a pro tanto practical ought, that's to say that it can be outweighed. The agent has a reason to do something, but may also have other reasons not to do it. For example, the pain that would result from a bad burn means that an agent has a reason not to grab onto a piece of hot metal with bare hands. But a need to rescue their child from a fire might override that reason. The agent still has a reason not to grab the piece of hot metal, but has a stronger reason to grab it, if that's the only way to rescue the child. So then, how can we derive these pro tanto practical oughts from purely factual premises? The first premise in deriving our ought says agent 1 has a desire that P. If agent 1 has an aversion to pain, then the agent 1 has a desire P1, where P1 equals that I not be in pain. If agent 1 is a loving parent, then the agent has a desire that P2, where P2 is that my child be alive. This is a descriptive claim. It's a claim that describes how neurons in the brain are wired. The second premise states that performing act A will make or keep P, the proposition that's the object of the desire, true. This is also a descriptive claim. It describes a causal relationship between performing act A and proposition P being made or kept true. From this, I draw the conclusion that agent 1 has a reason to perform act A. So, for example, agent 1 has a desire that agent 1 not be in pain. If agent 1 can avoid grabbing the hot metal, then agent 1 is not in pain can be made or kept true. Consequently, agent 1 has a reason to avoid grabbing the piece of hot metal. If somebody's concerned about the use of the phrase has a reason in the conclusion when it doesn't appear in the premises, I can offer a translation. This translation uses Hume's own theory of reasons. Ironically, I'll be leaning heavily on David Hume's own ideas regarding reasons and motivation in deriving moral ought from is. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy describes Hume's theory of reasons, or an updated version of it, as follows, quote, "If there's a reason for someone to do something, then she must have some desire that would be served by her doing it, which is the source of her reason," end quote. And the proposition that somebody has a desire that would be served is a descriptive statement. So the conclusion that the agent has a desire that would be served by performing act A does follow from the premises. The first premise states that the agent has a desire. The second premise states that the desire would be served by act A, from which we can conclude that the agent has a desire that would be served by performing act A, or in other words, that the agent has a reason to perform act A. I don't see this as being controversial. This is the standard analysis of a hypothetical imperative. It's widely accepted, though admittedly not without controversy, that the is-ought problem does not apply to hypothetical imperatives. It applies to everything except hypothetical imperatives. However, it's also argued that moral imperatives are categorical imperatives, and categorical imperatives can't be derived from descriptive premises. My answer to that will be that categorical imperatives don't exist. They're fiction, and that moral claims are a particular type of hypothetical imperative. As a hypothetical imperative, they can be derived from descriptive premises. Before I get to moral claims, I want to spend a few minutes on the all things considered practical ought. The all things considered practical ought is, what should I do? All things considered. What we need to do here is to derive all things considered practical ought conclusions from purely descriptive premises. For this, I'm going to suggest that the all things considered practical ought is the vector sum of all of an agent's pro tanto practical oughts. And by the way, I get this analogy from W.D. Ross in his book, The Right and the Good. Ross used it to explain the relationship between prima facie moral obligations and all things considered moral obligations. He then explains that distinction in terms of the vector sum of forces acting on an object in space. I'm going to borrow this analogy from Ross, and before I start, I'm going to show how vector sums actually work. So you have a body in otherwise empty space. Here it is. You have a force pushing on this body. That force has a particular direction, which we can illustrate by using an arrow pointing in that direction. The force also has a particular magnitude. We can represent magnitude using the length of the arrow. Longer arrows mean a stronger force. It's possible, in fact it's universally true, that more than one force can act on the same body at the same time. We can represent a second force by adding a second arrow representing the magnitude and direction of that force. And we can add a third or fourth or fifth or 117th. We can add all of the forces acting on a body. To calculate the total effect of all of these forces, we compute the vector sum. We can do this by placing the individual forces nose to tail one at a time, as shown on the right side here. The full effect of all of the forces acting on this object can now be computed by drawing a force vector from the tail of the first force to the nose of the last force. Now to calculate an all things considered practical ought. We have an individual. We'll call this individual blue. Now, each pro tanto practical reason that blue has a direction, which is to make or keep the proposition that is the object of a desire that P true. And each pro tanto practical reason has a magnitude, the strength of the desire. So let's assume that our agent, blue, has an aversion to pain, a desire that I, blue, am not in pain. Let's further assume that blue has a second desire, a desire that my child is alive. Under most everyday circumstances, these desires, the pro tanto practical oughts, are not in conflict. One can do both. So the agent chooses actions compatible with both preserving the life of the child and avoiding personal pain. However, situations can arise in which the two forces are in conflict. One has to choose. In these cases, one's all things considered practical oughts rule in favor of sacrificing the lesser value to the greater value. In this illustration, I'm putting the aversion to pain slightly to the left to keep the two pro tanto reasons visually distinct, but in making the calculation, we would put the pro tanto practical reasons nose to tail. The parent, in this case, has a pro tanto practical reason to find a way to rescue the child that would not be painful, but failing that, will accept the pain as the cost of rescuing the child. So, blue's all things considered practical ought is the vector sum of the pro tanto practical oughts. The thing that the agent all things oughts to do is to grab the piece of hot metal with his hands and rescue the child. This is not a description of actual behavior. This is the equivalent of what in a physics class would be a description of a world with massless strings and frictionless surfaces. For one thing, in the real world, we don't choose individual actions, we choose action plans. Action plans, for one thing, allow us to fulfill weaker desires before stronger desires. If the most efficient way for me to fulfill a strong desire to get home from work and a weaker desire to have milk for my cereal for breakfast is to stop by the store on the way home, then I can create an action plan that involves fulfilling the weaker desire first. What matters here is the fact that since each of the pro tanto practical oughts can be derived from descriptive is statements, as described above, the vector sum can also be derived from descriptive is statements. There's nothing metaphysically strange in this account so far. However, An all things considered practical ought is not a moral ought, and the goal is to derive moral oughts from descriptive claims. One can object that I'm smuggling an ought into my argument in the form of, you ought to use the vector sum of your pro tanto practical oughts. However, what I'm saying is that this vector sum is what all things considered practical oughts refers to. When we compute the vector sum of physical forces, we don't need to add a principle of you ought to take the vector sum of all of the individual forces. This is simply what determines the overall effect of all of the individual forces. Similarly, the vector sum of all of the pro tanto practical reasons simply is the all things considered practical reason. So now I'm going to try to do the same thing for moral oughts that I did for all things considered practical oughts. I'll start with this. I have an aversion to pain. This means I have a pro tanto practical reason to do things that will make or keep the proposition, I am not in pain, true. One potential source of pain is the intentional actions of other agents. People can do things that can cause me to be in pain. Those other people are acting on their own pro tanto reasons, which are rooted in their own desires and aversions. One of the ways in which I can keep the proposition, I am not in pain, true, is by giving other people pro tanto reasons not to perform those types of actions that could result in my being in pain. There are two ways in which I can accomplish this. First, I can manufacture external reasons. That is to say, I can promise to realize something the other person desires if they refrain from causing me pain, or I can threaten to prevent the realization of something they desire if they cause me pain. This is the realm of incentives and punishment. I can also give them internal reasons not to perform actions that would cause me pain. For example, if there was a way that I could cause other people to have an aversion to driving while drunk, then I can give them a reason not to perform the act of drunk driving by giving them that aversion. This in turn will reduce the chance that I and those I care about will be in pain or dead. I have reasons to avoid death as well. As it turns out, we can have an influence on the desires and aversions of other people, and thereby have an influence on their reasons for or against performing certain types of actions. We do so through social conditioning, in particular through expressions of approval and disapproval. The process of internalizing social norms fits in here. However, morality isn't the norms that a society does internalize. Morality is the norms that people generally have reasons to cause everybody to internalize. Now, my desire alone cannot generate a moral ought. But we can tell as a matter of fact that I have reasons to give other people reasons not to perform acts of a particular type. And we can tell as a matter of fact that I am not the only one. All of us, or nearly all of us, have pro tanto reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform those types of acts that tend to cause pain to others. Here I typically use drunk driving as my go-to example. People have reasons to prevent their own death and suffering. They have reasons to prevent the death and suffering of those that they care about. People generally have reasons to give everybody reasons not to drive while drunk. We have reasons to create external reasons in the form of fines, imprisonment, or the loss of a license. We have reasons to create internal reasons through our expressions of disapproval of those who drive while drunk. So, a moral ought exists when people generally have many and strong reasons to cause everybody to have reasons not to perform acts of a particular type. Drunk driving, breaking promises, the taking or destruction of other people's property without consent, lying under oath, assault, rape, various forms of abuse and exploitation, all types of acts that people generally have reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform. Note that in giving people reasons, we give them reasons to perform or not perform act types, not act tokens. External reasons, such as those provided through the law, concern act types such as drunk driving, fail to stop at a stoplight, lying under oath. Internal reasons are also reasons to perform or not perform actions of a particular type. It's simply impractical to be worried about creating external and internal reasons to engage in specific act tokens. It takes too much work for too little gain. And now it's important to note that the types of reasons that one is creating are pro tanto reasons. This means they can be outweighed. We can give people reasons not to break promises, for example, but at the same time, encourage them to have an even stronger reason to prevent suffering and death, one that's strong enough to outweigh the pro tanto reason to keep a promise when suffering and death could result. This is a good time to make good on my promise to discuss W.D. Ross's concept of prima facie duties in more detail. Ross, in his discussion, brings up the following example, quote, "If I have promised to meet a friend at a particular time for some trivial purpose, I should certainly think myself justified in breaking my engagement if by doing so I could prevent a serious accident or bring relief to the victims of one." End quote. Ross takes these two basic obligations to be prima facie obligations, a prima facie obligation to keep promises, and a prima facie obligation to prevent or relieve the victims of a serious accident. These two prima facie obligations are then weighed against each other to generate an all things considered obligation. Ross also uses the analogy to vector sums to explain the weighing. Quote, "Another instance of the same distinction may be found in the operation of natural laws. Qua subject to the force of gravitation toward some other body, each body tends to move in a particular direction with a particular velocity. But its actual movement depends on all of the forces to which it is subject." End quote. This is what we would expect if people were to have a pro tanto internal reason to keep promises and a pro tanto internal reason to prevent or relieve suffering. In a situation where the two pro tanto reasons come into conflict, we compute the vector sum, and this gives us our all things considered obligation. And note that the strength of the two pro tanto reasons are variable depending on the facts. Keeping a serious promise can outweigh the obligation to prevent or relieve minor suffering. But preventing serious death or injury, that can outweigh the pro tanto reason to keep a trivial promise. So now let's go back to the concept of a moral ought. That part of the description that says people generally have many and strong reasons to cause, well, that can certainly be derived from natural facts. These are the pro tanto reasons talked about at the start of this presentation. And what they're causing everybody to have are also the same type of pro tanto practical reasons. People are creating external incentives and punishments and internal desires and aversions, pro tanto reasons to perform or not perform actions of a particular type. Types like breaking promises, preventing or relieving suffering, drunk driving, assault, and so on. Now, there's a whole warehouse full of questions that still need to be answered, and those will be the subject of other videos. For example, are there any desires that do not create pro tanto practical reasons? My answer is no, but it's a matter of debate. Another question, can non-moral reasons outweigh moral reasons? When a non-moral reason and a moral reason come into conflict, does the moral reason always win? My answer is that the moral reason doesn't always win. If keeping a trivial promise involves a significant expense, one can break the promise with a proper apology and spare the expense. This falls short of a proof. It's about the best I can do in the space available, but I'll have other videos discussing other elements of this argument, and I invite you to leave your own objections in the comments. What I hope to have done with this presentation is to at least point in the direction of a particular derivation of moral ought conclusions from purely descriptive premises. It can be found somewhere in the direction of act types that people generally have pro tanto reasons to cause everybody to have external and internal reasons to perform or not to perform. These are act types like drunk driving, breaking promises, taking or destroying property without consent, promoting hatred or bigotry, lying under oath, arranging for fraudulent votes to be cast and counted, rape, murder, and the like. If successful, it means that the wrongness of this type of behavior is a demonstrable fact.